E. When I first saw the 2 lines on the pregnancy test, my heart skipped a beat. Excitement, fear, and guilt churned inside me like a storm. I should have been overjoyed, but instead, a shadow loomed over my happiness. This wasn't a simple announcement. It was a bombshell, and I knew it could destroy everything. My husband, David, had always dreamed of becoming a father. He'd talk about the kind of dad he wanted to be, how he'd coach Little League or teach our child to ride a bike. He'd been ready for years, but I kept stalling. Work, finances, timing. I always had an excuse. And now I had no idea how to tell him the truth about this pregnancy, because I wasn't sure if the baby was his. It had been a mistake, a single, fleeting moment of weakness. At least that's what I told myself to make it easier to bear. But the memory was vivid, etched into my mind like a scar. It wasn't just the act itself, but the emotional intensity of it. It had been forbidden, reckless, and completely out of character for me. Yet, it had happened. And now the consequences were staring back at me in the form of those 2 pink lines. I spent days agonizing over what to do. Should I tell David everything? Should I keep it to myself and hope for the best? The guilt was unbearable, but the thought of losing him was even worse. David was my rock, my safe haven. He didn't deserve this. I rehearsed my confession in my head 1,000 times. Each version felt inadequate, weak, like it couldn't possibly capture the depth of my remorse. Every night, as we lay in bed, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye, wondering if he could sense the weight of my secret. He seemed so peaceful, so trusting, and it broke my heart a little more each time. Finally, one evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat across from him at the dinner table, my hands trembling as I toyed with my fork. "David, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong?" I'm pregnant." For a moment, his face lit up with pure joy. "You're serious? That's amazing." He stood up and came around the table to hug me, but I couldn't meet his eyes. The words I needed to say next were caught in my throat. "There's more." I managed to choke out as he pulled back to look at me. His smile faded, replaced by a mix of confusion and worry. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I don't know if the baby is yours." The silence that followed was deafening. David's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something I couldn't quite define. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak, all rolled into one. "Explain," he said finally, his voice cold and measured in a way that sent chills down my spine. I told him everything, every painful, shameful detail. I didn't try to justify it or make excuses. I just laid it all out, hoping against hope that he could find it in his heart to forgive me. Tears streamed down my face as I spoke, but David's expression remained unreadable. When I finished, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "I need time," he said after what felt like an eternity. "I can't process this right now." I nodded, even though it felt like my world was crumbling. "Take all the time you need," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, David. I love you." He didn't respond. He just walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my guilt and the enormity of what I'd done. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. David stayed distant, barely speaking to me except when absolutely necessary. I gave him space, hoping he'd come to terms with everything and we could find a way to move forward. But every moment of silence felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. One evening, he came home from work and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying, but his expression was resolute. "I've been thinking," he said. "I love you, but this is a lot. I don't know if I can move past it." Tears welled up in my eyes. but I forced myself to stay calm. I understand, I said, my voice breaking. But please, let's try. Let's go to counseling, do whatever it takes. I can't imagine my life without you. He looked down at his hands, silent for a long time. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, he admitted. But for the sake of the baby, whoever's it is, I'm willing to try. Relief and sadness washed over me in equal measure. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was something, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. The road ahead wasn't easy. Counseling sessions were grueling, and the paternity test loomed over us like a ticking time bomb. But through it all, I clung to the hope that we could rebuild what we'd lost. Because despite everything, I still loved David with all my heart, and I was willing to do whatever it took to make things right.